Well met, everyone. I am Rich DeLitch, and today I'd like to talk to you about the different editions of D&D, all the way back from the beginning to its current edition, of course, 5th edition, and I just want to talk through a little bit of the various things about each edition that I liked and the things I didn't like, the good and the bad. Part of the catalyst of this is I remember watching some videos a few months ago, and I've talked with various other creators on various message boards and forums and whatnot, and it's kind of inevitable that at some point 6th edition is going to come out. It's just the evolution of the game itself. This is not to say there's anything wrong with 5th edition. Rather than saying that 5th edition is in a wonderful place, I think it's more of just the hobby and the actual tabletop role-playing, just as we've seen a resurgence in board games. The idea of sort of getting away from the screen a little bit, where video games took over, and again, this is also not to say that video games aren't taking over. I mean, Fortnite, games like that are blowing up, right? And WoW Classic is back. But I think there's just a huge resurgence of folk like you and I that are willing to get together with real-life friends and sit face-to-face at a table playing a game with each other. So I think D&D is in a wonderful space. That's not to say that it's only in a wonderful space specifically because of 5th edition. But I remember folks were talking about 5th edition's been out for a good 5-6 years now. If you look at the track record of it, it's about time that we might start seeing some newer stuff. I don't have any insider. I'm not a fly on the wall in the D&D headquarters and design studios over at WotC, and I'm not sitting there and I'm privy to the conversations of the designers. But I feel like as we start talking about and including content from Unearthed Arcana, and you're starting to create some new world settings and world books, where the rumor is Dark Sun at 5th edition will eventually come out, and Eberron is now about to really drop and get its legs within the 5th edition space, so on and so forth. Eventually, you're going to just start bringing in more players, you're going to start getting more ideas, you're getting a lot more input through social media and people like me, YouTube, Drive Through RPG is doing well, DM's Guild is doing well, so you're starting to get all this sort of open gaming license content, and it's starting to fill the 5th edition game space up. Eventually, there may be a 5.5 or a 6th edition. That's just the way things go as they sort of take all of this information, crunch it down, and boil it down to the nitty-gritty and the good parts, leaving out the bad parts. Another sort of catalyst for this video is, I remember when I was going through art and design school and video game design school, and we'd always talk about, Miyamoto, the Nintendo guy, right? And Mario creators and all this other stuff, and Zelda, and the success of certain games. And we can certainly talk about the design philosophies of the top studios like id Software and BioWare and Blizzard, and what they did that makes so many of their games so good. Why are we so invested into Larian Studios now after their release of Divinity 2, and just how good that game was, and the trust we're going to have in them in creating the new Baldur's Gate game, and so on and so forth. Oftentimes, top-level design, and this can apply to D&D as well, and tabletop role-playing, it's not so much what you put into any specific edition, it's what you leave out. In the fitness world, I'm a fitness professional, CrossFit coach, all that other good stuff, they always say that 80% of your physical fitness athletic results come from 20% of the things you do. Push-ups, pull-ups, chin-ups, dips, some squats, some deadlifts, sprint. You give me that, I really don't need all the other extraneous shit that's on the outside on the fringes. And I think different editions have done different things like this, where some maybe included too much, but when they went from one edition into the next, what made that next edition really good oftentimes is because there were certain things that were left out. And the beauty of 5th edition now, and eventually, whether it's a decade out on the horizon or it's coming up in the next year, is we've got so much input because of social media and so many people involved and giving their opinions and thoughts, just like I am. So let's just kind of chunk through these a little bit, and I'll tell you about the things that I think were good, the things that I think were bad, and maybe we can start to kind of piece together a little bit. And this is not to say, maybe I am. Maybe I'm revealing some secrets here, that I don't have some sort of 6th edition writing in the works, my own little iteration that I might put out there so that the WotC designers will see and be like, hey, this dude has some good ideas for what 6th edition D&D should be. Why don't we hire him? If you're a WotC designer and you're watching this video, have your people contact my people, or just send me an email at allthingslich@gmail.com. Okay, let's take a look at it. So, old D&D, which started about the year I was born, but when I'm 7 months old. I don't remember exactly a whole lot of things that I read, if I could read at that time. Old D&D had a game I think called Chainmail, which was a big like miniature wargaming game, whatever that means, that Gary Gygax was playing, and that was supposed to be like the big influence for D&D in the beginning. The interesting thing about Chainmail, though, is there was a system of rolling some dice to hit in range combat, and it always referenced some sort of a number. And I believe that was the first time in the iteration where, or the first instance where the idea of armor class came into play. And notice, even, fast forward 45 years later, it's still here today, armor class. So we have to definitely give some credit to Chainmail for that. Then there were a bunch of different kind of loose paper books that were released that started to put D&D into some sort of a rule set, some sort of a cohesive rules edition in various books. And then TSR started to put the things out there for the public, right? Put it on shelves, make it more accessible. And that's when they started to create all these different box sets that we might be familiar with, right? And you've got the basic edition and the expert edition and the blue cover and the red cover and all these different things. So there's definitely some nuances and rules and stuff in there, but that was when TSR really started to give us some meat that the public can chew on, some things we can actually grab off the shelves and buy. But I'm going to start with first edition D&D, the hardcover book. Okay, it's an iconic cover. This first edition book is, many people have considered, the best and most iconic. It just gave that image of, we are in something, a new world here. What is this game? So first edition D&D, let's talk about the things that I think were bad. There were too many nuances and differences within the various races and classes. What do I mean by that? Well, some classes literally got more EXP depending on what stats you had. There was something like if your fighter had a strength of 16 or greater, you got 10% more EXP. The wizard, or I think it was a magic user at the time, if he had a high intelligence, you got more EXP. So you're playing with the EXP and progression system based on the stats that were rolled in the beginning of the game. There were a lot of race class combos that were not possible. I think a lot of folks that never played old D&D don't remember those restrictions, where if you wanted to play, I think, like a cleric, it was kind of wonky. The only options for a cleric were half-elf, a half-orc, and a human. Human can kind of play everything. But it was just, that sort of thing. The iconic dwarven cleric didn't exist. There was a dwarven race, but you couldn't be the cleric. So you were limited in what you were allowed to play. Let me take a look at some of my notes here. There were level limits. So like the assassin, the thief, could not get beyond level 14. But yet the human, and this was always the strength of the human as a race, the human could go up to unlimited levels. Then there were also limits depending on your race, your stats, and your class. If you were a human fighter, you could level up and you were fine. But if you were a half-elfen fighter, you couldn't go past level 8. Furthermore, if you had less than a 17 strength, I think it was, you couldn't even go past level 6. So there were just a lot of weird fiddly bits with EXP differences and, restrictions. The paladin, for example, he needed 2,751 EXP to get to level 2. Whereas the rogue, or the thief, he only needed like 1,251 EXP. So we're looking at like a 1,500 point difference. So there were just little bits and things like that, where stats limited you and so on and so forth. I think that was the bad of, especially when we relate it to what D&D is now, is just sort of that restrictive nature to it. Now, what are the good things? There was this chart, I think it was like System Shock and Resurrection Survival, that was within Constitution. I liked that aspect. I like the thing where we can talk about whether it's Matt Mercer's resurrection rules. I feel like death is too hard to come by in 5th edition D&D and in current iterations of D&D. And, you fall, you're at 0, but you don't really go down to negative hit points unless you take negative your max hit points and then you're straight out dead. But you've got death saves, and there's so many little spare the dying and so many little things that can be done to make sure you kind of keep, they call it yo-yo or whatever you want to call it, right? Where he just kind of pops up, he drops, he pops up, he drops, he pops up, he drops. You get it. So there's so many ways that you can live. And then when you live, there's, raised dead and there's resurrection. And I like that first edition had this sort of survival chart referring to your constitution score. And maybe using something like that and implementing that as just a flat out percentage roll, where if you fail that and your constitution is not very high, there's a good chance you're not going to come back from the dead. Okay. This is not to say take away death saves, but when you literally die, you fail your third death save, or you just straight outright get killed through severe amounts of damage, you've got to roll against this Constitution chart. That's a cool thing from first edition that I like. Also, I like that there was, since there were so many little nuances and differences within each race and specific things that kind of made things exclusive, I like the things that carried over from that keep some iconic nature to it, such as dwarves just still, even in current editions, have more constitution generally than elves, and elves are more dexterous than dwarves. It still just kind of makes sense, and it gives us something familiar. Let's take a look at second edition D&D, the good and the bad. Well, there was, if we just talk a little bit about history, there was a lot of satanic panic during the time of second edition D&D, right? D&D is bad and it's devil worship stuff. Tom Hanks' first leading role was a movie called Mazes and Monsters. I remember watching this movie, and he went off the deep end, and he started to he wasn't able to disassociate, life from the game and whatnot, and he became suicidal and things like this. So I don't think it shined. I enjoyed the movie, but I don't think it shined a good light on it. And perhaps that was by intention. It's sort of showing it a little more mainstream of how bad this role-playing game can be. Second edition started to really remove a lot of the sexually suggestive artwork. They removed any options for evil playable characters, so the half-orcs were gone and assassins were gone. And then demons and devils were no longer referenced. And I think there was just a big change, perhaps negatively, in second edition because of the satanic panic. They wanted to disassociate from the things that people felt were dark and horrible and promoting just bad things for the young audience that was playing. Now, as for good things with second edition D&D, it began to include other genres into the mix. Second edition was the first time we saw things like Ravenloft, so you added an element of horror into the settings. It had Spelljammer, which brought like an essence of sci-fi into the edition. You had the apocalyptic nature of Dark Sun that was first introduced during the second edition rule set. So these new setting inclusions were sort of the foundation for some really cool campaign ideas and some worlds. And I think that started to bring about the idea of, as we went from second into third edition, it started to bring about the inclusion of other worlds and stories, which eventually did lead itself later on into like the Forgotten Realms and the Eberrons and such. Another really good thing about second edition was the implementation of non-weapon proficiency. So basically, what are the things you can do that are cool outside of combat? This is a big one because this essentially is where skills came from. In first edition, you did have like two books. I think one was called the Wilderness Survival Guide and the other was the Dungeoneer Survival Guide. Those did start to delve into, no pun intended, delve into a little bit of the skill set, but it was second edition was the first edition of D&D where they put it in the core rulebook, in the core player's handbook, where you started to now get into what we would know as skills, okay? Another good thing for second edition D&D, if all the bad was sort of removing the demons and devils and evil stuff because of satanic panic, here's another good one. Another good one was the separation of spells into different spheres and schools. That was the first time we saw that. And I think that's a good thing because look where it's gone now with 5th edition and how different the wizard can be if you are an evocation wizard versus an abjuration or divination wizard. So that was a really good plus for 2nd edition D&D. As we move into 3rd and 3.5, the bad of 3rd and 3.5, I'm going to kind of bulk them together. There were too many fiddly bits. Attacks of opportunity, back there in 3.0, 3.5, like Winter Wolves were TPK. You're prone. You get knocked down. You stand up, it's an attack of opportunity. And then as that attack of opportunity, I can do another trip attack to knock you back down. And then the first 5 feet doesn't count to attack of opportunity, but you can move. But then when you move into, it got a little wonky. But that was indicative of 3rd and 3.5 in and of itself, is there was just a lot of complexity, a lot of fiddly bits. There were some skills that were very redundant. I prefer sort of the change into 5th edition, where 3.0, 3.5 had, I think it was like both hide and move silent, whereas now we just have stealth. So there was some redundancy. There was a lot of crunch, is what they call it. There was a lot of meat there. There were too many books as well. I remember friends would come to my session in 3rd edition, 3.5, with a milk crate. between different kits and different fighter options and rogue options, and here's a rogue book, and here's a barbarian book, and here's things on like the raging guys, and there were so many damn books. Now, the strength of that though is during this time also we started to get more stuff, right? Pathfinder was becoming a big thing, and they had their sort of iteration and take on the 3rd edition 3.5 rule space. We started to notice there were miniatures that were kind of working with the whole aspect of, you see a picture of artwork of a monster in the book, and here's a miniature that looks just like that. So you can put that on the table. Companies started delving into terrain and Dwarven Forge and that type of stuff. Like that market started to really come up. So yeah, it can be bad that there was a lot of books and a lot of just crunch and just a lot in 3.0, 3.5. But those are also the things that keep a lot of players still going back to it, because we've just invested so much money and time into these things. Now, though I say those things can be bad, the good of 3.0 and 3.5 was the overall power. There were spells like Haste and Slow, which were just insanely powerful. These are good things. Options also, even though there was too much crunch, options can be very good because you can truly build your character in whatever direction you want. You can really go anywhere because there were so many small nuances and things you can dabble into to make a difference and make that character feel like it's exactly the hero or the villain that you want to play. I'm also quite biased because 3.0, 3.5 was a time when I ran a really massive D&D session. And I had it's one of my successful, if not my most successful campaign to date. And, I was really invested in Forgotten Realms, and we just had a good time playing, and we had the time to play 8-10 hours a night, on every single weekend. So it was just a really, really good time. Also, it really helped me settle into 3rd edition 3.5, like the Forgotten Realms and Eberron. Some of the best worlds that I think exist came about during this time for me. So there's a lot of really good things. So even though I say there's a lot, and that might have been a bad thing, for many, that can be a really good thing because it gave us so many options and fiddly bits. It felt like 3rd edition 3.5 was sort of, it may have excluded the new people simply because it was a little tough to get into. There were so many, if I brought in that milk crate and you said, hey, we're going to play this game, you've heard of D&D, but this is the first time you're ever playing it, they would look on the table and be like, dude, I don't even know where to begin, right? But for the gamer, for those that were willing to delve into it, for those that bought all those books and just invested themselves into 3.0 and 3.5, it felt like it just let nerds sit and be nerds among that table and just really have fun. So I think it was it was arguably, I really, really love 5th edition. 3rd, 3.5, those two, somewhere in there. I don't remember every little detail of what was changed and wasn't, but somewhere in there, that was probably among the best editions of D&D I've played. Yes, my memories, of course, are fonder going much further back before it was so invested into combat and the battle mats, and which we'll get into in the next edition here, 4th edition. I remember just being told stories. But when you're 13 years old and you're adventuring through caverns and catacombs, you're just more impressionable anyway. Let's take a look at 4th edition D&D. Well, what was the bad? A lot of these complaints are not just from me. Many people, if they were to pick the worst one of all D&D editions, many people would pick 4th. I also don't know the exact timeline of it, but I don't think it's an accident that 4th seemed to be the edition that stuck around the least amount of time. People said it was too video gamey. And there was a strong necessity for battle mats and minis, and it just felt a little one-dimensional. Right? And you had like these powers, the at will and encounter based and all this other stuff. And it felt like they were buttons that you would push on your screen. Now, interestingly, I think the release of 4th edition was somewhere around the middle of 2008. A game like World of Warcraft had already been out for about 4 years. But it was really starting to get its legs during that same time. And I don't know if this is a coincidence, what happened where. But when folks started really delving into and investing themselves into World of Warcraft, you had the expansion of Burning Crusade transitioning into Wrath of the Lich King, which many WoW players, and the reason why I keep bringing this up is WoW had like 11 million people playing it. And it's not unrealistic to say that a lot of this audience was kind of one and the same with the D&D folk, right? The tabletop players. And I know even personally, I lost a lot of, whatever, but I was one of them. I lost a lot of my table-based players to video games at this time. Now, I think it also coincided with just life in general. Of that was also the same time that a lot of my younger friends and stuff were growing up and they were, getting married and having kids. So the logistics of just getting people around the table was harder. And it was just something we remember from back when we were playing EverQuest and Dark Age of Camelot. It was just easier to come home from a long day at work. You want to spend time with your family, and you're not going to settle in on the weekend, and that's the only time you have off. You just jump on your computer, double click an icon real quick, and sit and play. You can get your same D&D friends to jump on with you and type and chat and talk cool nerdy stuff there and what movies you guys saw and set up the movie that you're going to go watch next Saturday. But you can also go raid. You can also jump into the dungeons and fight against the dragons and so on and so forth. So I don't know that it was an accident in the release of 4th edition and sort of the direction they went, where they saw that, tabletop role-playing was kind of at a lull. And I think WotC kind of had that, hey, they like just pushing buttons and they like this video game aspect. Let's try and create that in D&D format. I'm not trying to put words in the mouth of the designers as though that's what they said. But that's kind of what it felt like. And you had these cards. But every one of those things were, there wasn't like a role-play card that you can pull out that told you exactly how to negotiate with performance and persuasion and talk your way through an entire 8-hour session without fighting. No, it was very, here's my deck, let's open it up. Boom, I want to fight. I want to use this. Next fight, I use this. And it felt very, very video gamey. So, and the one-dimensional aspect of it. That is oftentimes cited as one of the bad things about 4th edition. Now, from the good side, number one, I like the mooks. The concept of you had those little one hit point bad guys, that oftentimes had some really devastating effects, or maybe they just hit really hard, but all you had to do was hit them or AE them, and you can kill them. I think you were able to AE them. I don't remember. But regardless, I like the idea of incorporating something like that now, where they're just fodder. They're things that you can kill in 5th edition. I use them now, that concept. They're very low hit points. I don't even have to track it. If you hit them at all and you put your attention to them, I'll just remove the miniatures off the board. But you have to deal with them because they're all giving pack tactics, or they're giving different bonuses to the commander that's on the board. So I like that aspect, because when you're so heavily invested in combat and at the table fights in 4th edition, you need little iterations of different levels of dudes that can be out there. So the mooks, the minion concept from 4th edition, I think is a good thing. I also did like the definitive aspect of, you knew exactly what things refreshed when. I like that aspect, and I think certain things like that, maybe they can be brought into some element of 5.5 or 6th edition, where I did like some aspect. I'm not saying use the exact same card system, but I did like some parts where you just knew, I only get to use this at this time. I only get to use this at this time. It was very definitive. Versus where we had just come from of 3.0, 3.5, as I said, with new players, there's so much power. It's kind of like if my wife was playing and I give her the wizard spell list in 3.5, she'd be like, I don't know which spell is the best to use when there's so much. Oh, well, let me tell you, haste is incredible, but then this. Whereas in 4th edition, it was like, see these 3 cards? Hold that. Whenever you fight, every fight, use them because you'll get them back every fight. See this one? You can do this as much as you want. You see this one? You only get to use it once a day. So there was that definitive aspect, which I think was a decent point. Also, it gave rise to an entire industry of Dwarven Forge and tabletop and crafting, and 5th edition is there today, where when I create any campaign or whatever, you're going to look at miniatures, and there's an automatic relationship, as I may have said in like 3rd edition and 3.5, where I can look through the 4th edition monster manual, and here's a monster, and on the shelves I can find that exact same monster. So there's a direct translation into board game form. And I know it felt very video gamey and board gamey, but there was that, it added an element of combat that made it visually appealing, and the aesthetic. And again, kind of talking about that very big difference of 3.5 felt so gamery. And that's a good thing. It really adhered, or it really resonated with the true hardcore D&D audience in a sense, because there were so many aspects, so many skills that you can go through the role-playing and social pillar, and you can go through the combat pillar, and there were so many fiddly bits. 4th edition kind of felt like, let's include everybody that we've lost, and let's take the video gamers out and the board gamers out, and let's throw them back into D&D. But it felt kind of dumbed down and too simple and nuanced. But when a new player walks by and sees that going on 4th edition on the table, they can be like, I don't know what you're playing, but I want to play that. And that's a good thing, because it can add just so much more to invest yourself into it. And from a business sake, it made some businesses flourish and work. People like tactile things. They like to see Hey, why can't I see the wizard? Because there's a gigantic resin wall of stone in front of you. Move the wall, that's what's behind it. There's a coolness to that. So I think 4th brought that element as well. Now let's move into where we are. Obviously, I can speak well to this because I've been playing 5th edition since it came out. All my campaigns are currently in 5th edition. I'm real big on always sort of staying with the current trend. So I'm not necessarily choosing 5th because it is unequivocally, especially in the beginning, the best edition I've ever played. You can never separate and talk good and bad of any edition without thinking of just the time and place that you were in life. I mentioned this in my video game video. Is Zelda a better game than Witcher 3? How the hell do you compare the two? I just know I was in a different point in my life. When you're 11 years old, everything is freaking cool when it's the first time you see it. You know what I mean? So it's hard to compare. There were times and people I played with that are no longer with me. They're dead. That I played during basic box set D&D stuff. And I remember conversations and I had fond memories of these things. So it's difficult to definitively say this is the best edition ever. And my point here in the video is not to end it with saying, here's where I think it all should be and this is it. Done. Also remember, I'm just a dude. I've been playing it for a long time, but my opinions, my thoughts, so on and so forth. 5th edition is just the one that I currently play. Folks said, hey, I heard you're a DM. You've DM'd a lot. You want to run some games for us? I got 5th edition books. They handed them to me. I went home. I read them all. I bought them on my local gaming store on Amazon, and I started playing. It's turned out very well. I think it's an amazing edition. The good about 5th edition that I like is similar to what 4th edition did of the inclusion of bringing in new players. There's a certain elements of complexity, right? Because every class feels so different and every class feels so viable. There is a big difference. You're not just playing a fighter anymore. There's a Eldritch Knight fighter, but then there's a Battle Master versus a champion. They feel different. The Barbarian still has the essence of that rage-fueled Barbarian. There's still those essential mechanics about each class that no other class has. You know what I mean? Like the Barbarian Rage is a defining characteristic of that class. But there's no way, just like the Wizard, you're a spellcaster, you're a studious guy, you get your spell book, and so on and so forth. But they've kind of made it a little friendlier. You don't have the drastic difference in hit dice and stuff. And, it's not like, oh, I have 2 spells, and once I'm done casting those, I'm just shooting a dart or a crossbow or throwing darts, and that's all I can do. Is every class feels they have a strong essence of who they are and what they're about. And that's a really good positive thing. So it helps bring everyone in. Obviously, we're in a time period in life where, socially and just inclusivity and stuff like that, and sexes and genres, and genders and various things like this. There's no restrictions as there used to be back in 1st edition. You can play any male, female. There's no differences in what kind of strength you have, and you can be the Brienne of Tarth from Game of Thrones, right? And we see it everywhere. It's in media, it's in other games. Lara Croft is one of the baddest chicks, in all of video gaming, and she's the best hero. And then you have the male hero, and then you have the fallen female champion and the fallen male champion. So there's a lot of just including anyone that wants to play. So that's a good thing about 5th edition. The content is top notch. I believe just the availability of feedback, right? Whether we have D&D Beyond and various message boards and forums, new books come out, all sorts of things come out, and people can kind of give their take on it. You have these entire websites and things that have builders where you can build through the best ranger or the strongest battle master and what's the highest AC I can get for my paladin and so on and so forth. And people will, I call it, nerd number crunch. What do they call it in baseball? Analytics. They can break that stuff down in Excel spreadsheets and tell you this is not the most optimum build and this and that. But then you have that relationship of the metagamer, power gamer aspect contrasted with the DM who has to invest his time and energy into all these different things. We've got references like Critical Role and Twitch streaming and various things that we can go to just see an actual example of maybe how to run a better game and how to run a better NPC. There's a lot of strengths there. I'm not going to talk about all the nuances and the number crunch of what's good, what's bad. I like the simplified skill list. I like that it can focus enough on the 3 pillars of combat. For a bad aspect of 5th edition, the only thing I might say is there's so many websites on the builds and how to make the optimum character of. Sometimes there's too many players trying to win. I don't want to disrespect that. because it's hard for me not to come at this from the perspective other than the side of the DM screen where I'm the dungeon master, as I don't really enjoy playing as much, as not even close, as I do DMing. So I don't want to say, I've never been in their shoes enough to see the worth and value of that, but I do miss a little bit of make your character now in 5th edition simply because it's a cool idea and something you think might work. That's it. Maybe focus on the background, and you were once a fisherman, you had something happen to your family, and now you want to go out and protect and save the world and others from harm by being some kind of a fighter. Don't make it by going through a build chart and an Excel sheet and putting in every number crunch and figuring out what's the most damage I can do as a fighter in my combat and how many attacks can I get. Because as I said to my wife recently, who is not a veteran role player, never played the earlier editions, I said, don't focus on the crunch of what's on your sheet, because if I don't tell you to roll initiative, you have no story to your character, and there's nothing that you can offer. You don't know how to respond to any situation. You don't know if you should help the good guys or the bad guys, because you don't know who you are as a character. If all you are as a character is an abjuration wizard that abuses this spell and min-maxes this thing and does this, what happens when we play a whole session and there's no roll initiative? But inherently, the system is designed around, 5 to 8 encounters per day. The rest mechanic. I mean, the rulebook itself, if you took out anything related to combat, you'd have a 7-page rulebook. So the system, I think, maybe if we were to look into, as I said in the very beginning of the video, maybe I am dabbling into a 5.5 or a 6th edition version. My version of D&D is maybe create a little more, and I know you can always hand wave this and say it's up to the DM to do that, but make it in the rule set, as it used to be. Make it a little bit more where there's a lot of crunch there for things that don't happen when combat is happening. You know what I mean? Like add a little, 5th edition can feel a little one-dimensional at times as well. So that's my slight on it. But that was a certainly long enough video. I'm just rambling. I'm just having some coffee with you. Thank you everyone for watching, and take care.